Winnebago 911.
A man was shot.
Are you with the person right now?
Yes.
Is he breathing?
Yes.
Okay. Where is the assailant?
Somewhere in the house.
Okay, is it male, female?
Female.
For a woman accused of murdering her boyfriend in Menasha.
Killing happened in February in Menasha.
The court commissioner set bond at $1 million for Catherine Chesky, the woman accused of shooting and killing her 71-year-old boyfriend at their Menasha home last week.
And found 54-year-old Catherine Ann Chesky guilty of first-degree intentional homicide.
I shot somebody. I have a whole lot more blood on me. He was my second shot at love. He's not dead. He can't be dead. Oh my God, no!
Menasha, Wisconsin, nestled along the Fox River, is the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where snow blankets the roofs like frosting in winter, and where time moves just a little bit slower. It's not the sort of town you expect to wake up to murder headlines.
The court commissioner set bond at $1 million for Catherine Chesky, the woman accused of shooting and killing her 71-year-old boyfriend at their Menasha home last week. Chesky is now charged with first-degree intentional homicide.
But on the morning of February 24th, 2024, police responded to a call from a quiet residential block on Chute Street. What they found inside one of those homes would shatter the illusion of calm and raise questions that no one in this town was prepared to answer. A single gunshot had pierced the silence of dawn. No one had called it in, not from inside the house. The 911 call came from a neighbor, someone who had heard an argument followed by a loud, unmistakable sound.
Winnebago 911.
A man was shot.
Are you with the person right now?
Yes.
Is he breathing?
Yes.
Okay. Where is the assailant?
Somewhere in the house.
Okay, is it male, female?
Female.
A sound that told them something was very, very wrong. When officers entered the home, they found a scene that felt more surreal than sinister at first glance. A 55-year-old woman sitting naked on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, saying no one had been harmed. Her demeanor was calm, eerily so. That woman was Catherine Chesky, and just a few feet away in the bedroom lay the body of Thomas Guyette, a 71-year-old man who had once been her partner, her companion, maybe even the love of her life. Now he was dead, killed by a single bullet to the chest, fired from close range.
Closing arguments wrapped up and jury deliberation is underway for a woman accused of murdering her boyfriend in Menasha.
Winnebago County jury has reached a verdict in the trial of a woman charged with the deadly shooting of her boyfriend.
The killing happened in February in Menasha.
Well, Tom and Michelle, after almost 4 hours of deliberating, the jury reached a verdict and found 54-year-old Catherine Ann Chesky guilty of first-degree intentional homicide.
No sign of struggle, no call for help, no explanation that made any sense. But this was no random act of violence. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a stranger's rage spilling into a stranger's home. This was something far more intimate and far more dangerous. The kind of danger that brews behind closed doors and builds slowly, day after day, until one morning it explodes. Neighbors had seen the cracks, frequent yelling, late-night arguments, slamming doors, but no one expected it would come to this. A domestic disturbance? Maybe. But murder? Not here. Not from Catherine, who often kept to herself. Not from a woman who now claims she was legally blind and unable to shoot a target even if she tried. But nothing about this case was as it seemed. Catherine would go on to offer multiple versions of the same story, none of them consistent. First, she claimed the gun simply went off as she tried to take it from Thomas. Then, she suggested that maybe Thomas shot himself. Later, she mentioned her deteriorating vision, saying she couldn't have possibly aimed, and all the while the evidence was piling up. Gunshot residue on her hands. No sign of forced entry. An audio recording, nearly an hour long, of the final argument between them. Words that cut deeper than any weapon, painting a picture of a toxic, volatile relationship that had been spiraling for years. The case was a ticking time bomb. Prosecutors would eventually argue that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, It was a premeditated act, a final eruption after years of emotional warfare. But the defense had their own version of the story. Catherine, they said, had been emotionally abused, berated, and beaten down over time. The shooting, they claimed, wasn't murder. It was a reaction, a breaking point.
I took the gun away from him. I went in the bedroom and I took the gun away from him. How could he be dead? I took the gun away from him. I heard the gun go off and I took it away from him and I took it in the living room.
What really happened in that house that morning? Was it an act of cold-blooded rage or the desperate move of a woman pushed too far? Why didn't she call for help? And how does a person go from living with someone to taking their life? As the trial unfolded, it became clear that this case wasn't just about one bullet. It was about every word, every scream, every moment that led up to that final silence. A silence so thick it could only be broken by a single sound, the echo of a gunshot. This is the story of Thomas Guyette, the man who died, of Catherine Chesky, the woman who stood accused, and of the fragile line between love and loathing, one that once crossed can never be uncrossed. Stay with us, because nothing about this case is simple, and the truth, well, the truth might be the darkest thing of all. In every town, there are stories whispered behind curtains, relationships that seem strained, couples who argue too loudly, too often. On the surface, they're just another couple navigating the complexities of life. But behind closed doors, something darker brews. For Thomas Guyette and Catherine Chesky, their relationship was a slow descent into emotional chaos, marked by volatility, mistrust, and conflict that had been simmering long before that fatal February morning. Thomas A. Guyette, 71, had lived in Menasha, Wisconsin for many years. To most who knew him casually, he was quiet and kept to himself. He wasn't particularly social, but neither was he a recluse. He had a small circle and, by all accounts, lived a relatively low-key life. Age was catching up with him, but he still maintained a sense of independence and a sharp temper that neighbors occasionally overheard during his spats with Catherine. Catherine Ann Chesky, 55, had her own set of challenges. She had been legally blind for several years, something she often cited in moments of frustration or defense. She was unemployed and had a reputation for being emotionally volatile. Her relationship with Thomas was her primary anchor to the outside world, but that anchor seemed to drag rather than steady her. Friends and neighbors knew little about her life before she met Thomas, but what they saw after they started living together painted a troubling picture. The pair shared a residence on Chute Street in a modest two-story home divided into units. Catherine and Thomas occupied the upper level. From the beginning, their cohabitation was marked by tension. Neighbors often reported raised voices, banging furniture, and arguments that echoed through the walls at all hours of the night. There were moments of quiet, yes, but they were always temporary. The underlying instability of their relationship never truly went away. Despite the turbulence, they stayed together. Whether out of necessity, codependence, or something else entirely, no one could say. There were no reports of physical violence serious enough to warrant arrest, but police had visited the residence multiple times over the years in response to domestic disturbance calls. Each time, the matter was either de-escalated or resolved without further incident. But each visit was another thread unraveling the frayed bond between them. By 2024, things seemed to have worsened. Catherine had become more withdrawn, and Thomas was increasingly irritable. The two had fallen into a toxic cycle of arguments, reconciliations, and silences that spoke louder than words. Friends and neighbors alike noticed that Catherine, once somewhat sociable, had become isolated. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she often looked disheveled or agitated. Thomas, on the other hand, had become sharper in tone, his patience thinning, his temper flaring more easily. Financial strain may have also played a role. Both were living on limited means with no clear sign of outside income. The pressures of aging, illness, and isolation were weighing down on them, individually and as a couple. Catherine's legal blindness had become a defining feature of her defense later in court.
I'm legally blind. I can't fire a gun. I mean, there's no way I could ever aim and shoot and actually hit something.
Let's go
And
back
if
a
I
little bit.
did, I mean, it would be like one shot. Better play the lottery then.
But within the household, it may have contributed to growing frustration and dependency. What's striking is how familiar this scenario is to law enforcement and domestic violence advocates. A pattern of emotional escalation, the absence of meaningful intervention, and a slow decline into psychological warfare. Each argument chips away at the foundation of trust until there's nothing left but resentment and sometimes rage. The audio recording recovered and later presented in court revealed just how toxic their final hours were. While that recording would only come into public knowledge during the trial, it served as a chilling insight into a relationship that had deteriorated beyond repair. For nearly an hour, the two hurled accusations, insults, and emotional wounds at one another. It wasn't a single fight. It was a culmination of years of unresolved hostility compressed into one final explosion. Catherine and Thomas had no children together. There were no close family members living nearby. It was just the two of them, locked in a spiraling dance of codependency and animosity, trapped in a house that became both a home and a battleground. By the time the sun rose on February 24th, 2024, their story had already written its final chapter. But in order to understand how it ended, one must first understand how it began. Two people, both isolated, both struggling, clinging to each other not out of love, but because they had nowhere else to go. And in that house on Chute Street, that helplessness turned fatal. It was just after 5 a.m. on February 24th, 2024, when the tranquility of Chute Street in Menasha, Wisconsin, was pierced by a single sharp sound, a gunshot. It came from the upstairs unit of a modest home, but the woman inside didn't scream. She didn't flee. She didn't call for help. Instead, she sat on the couch, naked, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by silence. It wasn't until a downstairs neighbor, alarmed by the argument that had preceded the shot, dialed 911 that authorities were even aware something had gone terribly wrong. When officers arrived, they were met with an unusual and deeply unsettling sight. The front door opened to reveal Catherine Chesky, disheveled and barely clothed, her demeanor calm, almost vacant. There was no panic in her voice, no visible distress. She told police no one had been shot. Her flat denial only deepened the confusion as officers stepped into the dimly lit apartment and began their search. What they found in the bedroom froze the scene in time. Thomas Guillet, 71, lay dead on the bed, a gunshot wound to his chest, the blood staining the sheets beneath him. The shot had been fired at close range, something the coroner's later report would confirm as a contact wound. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds, just a lifeless body and a woman who hadn't lifted a finger to help. And that was the first major red flag. No 911 call from Catherine. In the critical minutes following the shooting, she made no effort to seek emergency assistance, to render aid, or even to acknowledge what had happened. The gravity of that inaction weighed heavily in the minds of investigators from the start. As officers continued their sweep of the home, Catherine began to speak, offering explanations without being asked. She claimed the gun had gone off accidentally while she was trying to wrest it away from Thomas. Then she said maybe he had shot himself. Later, she insisted her legal blindness made it improbable that she could have even aimed a gun. But the gun was found near the scene, and forensic testing would eventually tell a different story. When detectives arrived to question her, the contradictions only grew. Catherine couldn't clearly explain where the gun had come from or how the shooting had occurred. Her statements were riddled with inconsistencies. In one version, she had the gun. In another, Thomas did. Sometimes she said it discharged during a struggle. Other times, she blamed the incident entirely on him. Her explanations changed as frequently as her tone. But one detail remained consistent. She never called for help. Crime scene technicians processed the room meticulously. The wound's location and angle ruled out suicide almost immediately. There was no stippling, no hesitation wound, no suggestion that Thomas had done this to himself. But the most damning discovery came during forensic analysis. Gunshot residue, GSR, was found on Catherine's hands. This scientific evidence stood in direct contradiction to her defense. If she truly hadn't fired the weapon, how had GSR ended up on her skin? And if she was as visually impaired as she claimed, how had she managed to shoot a man with such lethal precision from such a close distance? Adding to the complexity was the audio recording. Though its full contents wouldn't be revealed until trial, investigators obtained a nearly hour-long audio file from a device in the apartment, perhaps a phone inadvertently recording or intentionally set up during the argument. The recording captured the raw, aggressive exchange between Catherine and Thomas. It was a verbal war, heated, cruel, and emotionally charged. Catherine's voice was sharp, relentless. Thomas, too, fought back with scathing remarks. It was not a moment of passion, it was a culmination of rage. What had started as another argument between two people stuck in a cycle of resentment ended with a gunshot and a corpse in a bedroom. Catherine's emotional state post-shooting was as haunting as the act itself. Not frantic, not remorseful. Just still. In that moment, investigators weren't just trying to piece together a crime. They were trying to unravel the psychology of a woman who had spent the minutes after a man's death sitting silently, offering no help, no apology, no answers. The facts were growing more undeniable by the hour. The physical evidence, the contradictions in Catherine's account, and her unnerving calm in the face of tragedy all painted a chilling portrait. Whether out of rage, fear, or something far more sinister, Catherine Chesky had pulled the trigger. And the man she once shared a home and a life with was now reduced to a headline and a growing list of unanswered questions. With the crime scene secured and Thomas Gayette's lifeless body removed from the bedroom, the Menasha Police Department turned its attention to what would become a complex and psychologically layered investigation. From the outset, nothing about Catherine Chesky's behavior made sense. Her calm demeanor, the lack of a 911 call, the vague and shifting explanations, each of these details raised red flags. But police knew that gut feelings weren't enough. They needed evidence, concrete, irrefutable proof to explain what had happened in that apartment. The first piece of the puzzle came from Catherine herself. Almost immediately after the shooting, she began speaking to officers without being prompted.
So
He can't be because we're getting married.
so it's very, like, that's why what you can tell us is very, very important about everything of how that happened, right?
You guys are right? He's not dead. He can't be dead. He can't be dead. He was my second shot at love. He can't be dead. Oh my God, no. No. Oh my God.
Her stories were riddled with contradictions. She first claimed that she and Thomas had been arguing and that he had retrieved the gun himself. According to this version, she tried to take it from him and it discharged during the struggle. Then, in a different account, she suggested that perhaps Thomas had shot himself. Still later, she added that due to her legal blindness, she couldn't have aimed a gun well enough to hit anyone intentionally. She said the weapon just went off. These shifting narratives didn't align with the physical evidence. The gunshot wound on Thomas was classified as a contact wound, meaning the gun had been pressed directly against his body when it fired. Suicide was ruled out early, both due to the angle of the wound and the nature of the scene. The position of the body, the blood spatter, and the location of the gun all suggested that someone else had pulled the trigger and done so from extremely close range. Then came the forensic results. Gunshot residue, GSR testing, was conducted on both Catherine and the surrounding area. The results were damning. GSR was found on her hands, a key indicator that she had discharged a firearm or been in very close proximity when the gun was fired. While Catherine tried to argue that GSR could transfer through other means, such as touching the gun after it had been fired, investigators were not convinced, especially when combined with her failure to call emergency services and her inconsistencies. Another key discovery came from a downstairs neighbor who reported hearing an hour-long argument leading up to the gunshot. That neighbor also provided information that led to the recovery of a recorded audio file from a device inside the home. likely a smartphone that had either been intentionally set to record or captured the incident accidentally. The contents of that recording would become central to the prosecution's case. Though the full tape wasn't released to the public during the investigation phase, police reviewed it extensively. The recording painted a picture of a toxic, emotionally volatile relationship that had spiraled far beyond typical domestic disputes. The voices of Catherine and Thomas could be heard escalating into vicious accusations, demeaning language, and increasingly aggressive exchanges. Catherine was reportedly heard shouting, crying, and threatening, while Thomas responded with equally harsh verbal attacks. It was a verbal war that had clearly been fought many times before, but this time it ended with a gunshot. The emotional content of the audio wasn't the only damning element. There were no signs of self-defense injuries on Catherine, no bruising or indications that she had been physically attacked prior to the shooting. In fact, there were no visible signs that Thomas had even attempted to harm her that morning. That, coupled with her post-incident inaction, no attempt to revive him, no emergency call, not even a plea for help, strengthened the argument that this wasn't a moment of accidental chaos, but rather an intentional act carried out in the heat of rage. Investigators also examined the firearm itself. The gun was legally owned by Thomas, but it was found near the scene, within easy reach of where Catherine had been located. Ballistics confirmed it as the weapon used in the shooting. There were no signs of misfire or malfunction. The gun had operated exactly as it should, and there was no physical evidence suggesting that it had discharged by accident. As detectives compiled their findings, the case against Catherine grew stronger. Her credibility, already undermined by her inconsistent accounts, collapsed under the weight of the physical evidence and forensic data. Though she insisted she had never meant for anyone to get hurt, her actions told a different story. And the deeper investigators dug into the relationship between her and Thomas, the more it became clear that this was not a one-time outburst. It was the tragic crescendo of years of unchecked dysfunction. By the time the case was handed over to the district attorney, the pieces had formed a grim but coherent narrative. Catherine Chesky had shot and killed Thomas Guyette, and while she might have seen herself as a victim of verbal abuse and emotional torment, the law saw something else, a woman who had chosen silence over accountability and who would now face the full weight of justice. By December 2024, nearly 10 months after the fatal shooting of Thomas Guyette, the case of Catherine Chesky entered the courtroom, dragging with it layers of emotional baggage, conflicting narratives, and a community still trying to understand how a relationship had spiraled into deadly violence. The courtroom in Winnebago County became the final battleground between two versions of the same story, one told by the prosecution, sharp and fact-based, and the other by the defense, raw with emotion and laced with claims of long-term abuse. From the very first day, the prosecution wasted no time laying out its theory. Catherine Chesky intentionally shot and killed Thomas Guyette during a heated argument, then failed to call for help or take responsibility. They framed her actions not as a momentary lapse or accident, but a massive overreaction, a deliberate decision made during an emotionally charged confrontation. Prosecutors walked the jury through the forensic evidence, highlighting the gunshot residue on Catherine's hands, the close contact nature of the wound, and, most damningly, her failure to call 911 after the shooting. They played the nearly hour-long audio recording of the argument leading up to the shooting. The courtroom fell silent as jurors listened to the chaos unfold in real time. The voices of Catherine and Thomas could be heard, sharp, bitter, and emotionally raw. The prosecution used this as a cornerstone of their argument. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, and it ended with Catherine making a choice, a fatal one. One of the detectives testified that Catherine offered at least 4 different versions of what had happened that morning. Each one shifted responsibility or softened the facts, and none matched the forensic timeline. She said the gun went off during a struggle, the detective told the jury. Then she said Thomas shot himself. Later, she said she was legally blind and couldn't have hit a target, but the evidence says otherwise. To further discredit her claims, prosecutors introduced ballistics and forensic analysis, showing the trajectory and angle of the bullet, confirming it was not an accidental discharge, nor self-inflicted. The location of the gun, the lack of struggle marks on Catherine, and the complete absence of any CPR attempts or emergency calls all painted a chilling picture. To the state, this wasn't just murder, it was intentional, cold, and calculated. But the defense had its own strategy. They didn't deny that Catherine had fired the shot. Instead, they attempted to reframe the context. Catherine was a woman pushed to the brink by years of verbal and emotional abuse. They painted Thomas as a man who, though never criminally charged, had been relentlessly cruel, demeaning, and psychologically controlling. Her legal blindness, they argued, left her vulnerable and dependent, and in a moment of panic, she reacted not out of malice, but desperation. Defense attorneys replayed parts of the same audio recording, urging the jury to listen not just to what was said, but how it was said. Catherine's voice trembled, cracked with emotion. Thomas, at times, was heard berating her, dismissing her, fueling the volatile atmosphere. She was terrified, her lawyer told the jury. This wasn't premeditated, it was survival. They brought in a psychologist who testified that Catherine may have suffered from a form of battered woman syndrome, a controversial but occasionally accepted defense in domestic homicide cases. The doctor explained how chronic emotional abuse can erode judgment, trigger hyperreactivity, and create a distorted sense of reality during moments of extreme stress. Still, the prosecution responded forcefully. If she was terrified, why didn't she call for help afterward? The district attorney asked. Why didn't she try to save him? Why sit on the couch, silent, while a man lay dying in the next room? The question lingered, unanswered. Catherine did not take the stand. Her defense team feared that under cross-examination, her conflicting stories and calm demeanor might work against her. Instead, they let the arguments and testimony speak for her. But in the end, the jury wasn't swayed. After less than 2 days of deliberation, the verdict came in, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. As the sentence was read, Catherine showed little emotion, just a slight nod, as if she had already accepted her fate. The courtroom remained still, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. The woman who once shared a home with Thomas Guillet would now spend decades behind bars for his murder. The case wasn't over yet. There would be motions, an appeal, and a restitution hearing still to come. But the trial had delivered its final judgment. The truth, the jury decided, was simple. Catherine Chesky pulled the trigger, and for that, she would pay the ultimate legal price. The conviction of Catherine Chesky brought a sense of closure, but it also left behind an unsettling silence in the community of Menasha. On February 18, 2025, nearly a year after the murder of 71-year-old Thomas Guillet, Catherine stood before the court to hear her sentence. Life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She was 55 at the time. The courtroom remained still as the judge delivered the sentence, denying the defense's request to stay the judgment while they pursued an appeal. It was a clear and final declaration. This was no accident, no momentary loss of control. It was murder. The judge highlighted not just the act itself, but Catherine's chilling lack of response afterward. The fact that she never called 911, never tried to help, never expressed remorse. Her silence had spoken louder than any defense could muster. The prosecution reminded the court of the audio recording, the gunshot residue, and her many conflicting statements, all pointing to deliberate intent. For those who knew the couple, the sentence was heavy but necessary. Neighbors had heard their arguments for years but never imagined it would come to this. In a house where shouting had once been routine, now there was only the echo of what had been lost. A restitution hearing was scheduled for March 4th, 2025, though no monetary figure could ever compensate for the life that was taken. There was no large public outcry, no national attention. But for a small community, the lesson struck deep. Domestic abuse isn't always visible. Sometimes it hides in routine arguments, in emotional scars, in the slow erosion of peace. Catherine Chesky now faces the reality of spending the rest of her life behind bars. And while the law has spoken, the emotional wreckage left behind will linger for far longer than any sentence ever could. Catherine Chesky didn't just pull the trigger. She sat in silence afterward, wrapped in a blanket, while Thomas lay dead just steps away. No cries for help, no panic, only cold stillness. And that eerie stillness may haunt those who followed the case more than the violence itself. This wasn't a story of a sudden breakdown or a one-time mistake. It was a crescendo of unresolved conflict, dependence, and bitterness. The emotional abuse Catherine claimed to endure may have been real. The dysfunction between them may have been mutual. But the court determined that none of it justified ending a man's life. Now she serves a life sentence in a state facility where her world has shrunk to a cell and routine. Her name has become synonymous with betrayal in Menasha, while Thomas has become a symbol of a fate no one expected. A man dying in silence, not from a stranger's malice, but from domestic rage. This case leaves behind uncomfortable truths. That emotional abuse can escalate into fatal outcomes. That victims don't always look like victims. That perpetrators aren't always monsters in the dark, but sometimes people hiding in plain sight. Let this story be a reminder. What happens behind closed doors can destroy lives. And if we ignore the signs, we risk waking up one day to a silence that says everything. If you found this story insightful, disturbing, or thought-provoking, like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the unsettling truths we too often overlook. Because sometimes the quietest houses hide the loudest tragedies.